Affairs, our international webinar on the United States elections and the Jewish vote, priorities and concerns of American Jews and implications for Israel. I would like to ask first the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Ambassador Dori Gold, to provide us with a few remarks and introduction both to the webinar and to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, the JCPA. Dori, please.
Well, thank you. When you get involved in webinars of this sort, sometimes you go back to your academic background and you try and recall what might be related that can help you get a handle on the subject. Well, one of the things that happens when you write a doctorate, when you're doing a doctorate at Columbia University, which is where I studied, you have to read something like 200 books. And then you have your oral examinations. Why is that relevant? Because one of those books that I had to read back then was a book called American Federalism by an author named Daniel Elazar. And it was an outstanding book. And one of the things that Elazar showed was that America was divided up into areas that were largely oriented politically by where their immigrants came from. So just as a quick example, Minnesota was a state settled by very liberal Protestants. The same was true for the state of Wisconsin. And then we saw who were the senators and congressmen who came from those states. They corresponded with that analysis. In any event, what was important was that during election periods, the entire system gets reoriented many times, not always, but many times. And there is an expression among political scientists in the United States. It's called a critical election, an election that sort of redoes the political map. And so, one becomes cognizant of the fact that you have, political parties dominating the American political scene, and then a critical election comes around and things change. Well, a lot of the commentary about this election, including the Jewish community, but not just the Jewish community, was that different groups in American society were going to alter their orientation as a result of developments that had occurred since the last election. And that analysis was used, yes, with the Jewish community, but also with the Black American community, also with the Latino community. And so you're in a new reality all of a sudden that you have to get a grip on and you have to understand. So I'm saying this as a means of introduction because I think if we can get a sense at the very beginning of where America is going, it will help us operate intelligently in the period ahead. I think nobody can really answer this with assuredness, but I believe that being cognizant of what is going on, of the debates in different communities and in different geographic parts of America, I think that will help the state of Israel understand its most important ally still today. So I will now turn this back to Howard Weisband and he can go through the speakers.
Dori, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as Dori just mentioned, my name is Howard Weisband. I'm a fellow here at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and a member of the board. I have the honor of moderating today's webinar with you and for you. A couple of housekeeping details, if I may. Our webinar will be 1 hour. Where audience, you, our international audience, will be off camera, but you will be able to submit questions through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. I will make a brief introduction for each presenter, very brief, so as to preserve our time for their 5 to 7 minute capsule-like presentations and good interaction among them and among us to follow. The audience, you are encouraged to go to the presenters' websites or to Google to gain access to complete bio information. The bios of each of our excellent presenters are extremely thorough, and we're not taking the time, I must say, to introduce them in full today, but I encourage you to go to their websites. A recording of this webinar will be available on jcpa.org, our Jerusalem Center website, in a couple of days. So let's get started. Dori has introduced our webinar as president of the JCPA. I first want to ask Michal Kotler-Wunsch to present her thoughts on implications for Israel as a result of the recent elections. Michal has to run to the Knesset from her office in a few minutes to Davka deliver a speech on the floor of the Knesset, and hopefully we'll be able to return to our webinar. Brief introduction. Michal is a member of the Israel Knesset representing the Blue and White Party. She has an LLB from Hebrew University and an LLM from McGill University, and currently is a doctoral student at Hebrew University. In the Knesset, among her many other appointments, she is the chair of the subcommittee on Israel's relations with the diaspora and a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. So you see that her work in the Knesset really relates to the results of the current election in the United States. Michal, if you would, please.
So first of all, thank you very much. And it really is truly an honor and humbling to present together with such an illustrious panel today on such an important topic and timely topic, of course. And I thank Ambassador Gold, of course, for setting the stage, first of all, in enabling me to put on my academic hat for a moment, which I miss desperately. And I am indeed a doctoral student on hold at the moment because there's no time in Knesset. The second is really mentioning Danny Elazar, and that opportunity to really reflect on his important insights. And the third is actually maybe where I'll start from, and that is the reference to the processes that the United States has undergone and the importance when we answer this question on how these elections affect Israel. I think that it's very important, and maybe this is my academic hat, but maybe not. It's what I bring with me into Knesset, actually, I think too. I think it's very important that we reflect on these processes and not only what bind us together, so some of the similarities in the processes that Israel has been through, but also what sets us apart. And I think that it's very important to differentiate those. I think that, you know, we very oftentimes, because we have such incredibly deep shared values, mission and vision between the two countries and in those important relationships, we sometimes confuse the differences as well. And they're important to note, I believe, in the context of what these elections bring with them, so that we can improve and deepen the engagement between us. And when I say between us, it's not just Israel and the United States, it's also Israel diaspora relations, or maybe Israel and North American Jewry, because I believe that those processes have also affected the relationship between us. And we are at a really historic moment, an opportune time to engage with all of them. So if I begin with that and with both what binds us together and possibly the acknowledgement of what sets us apart, then I would say that the first and most important thing to me, and I mention this in every context as a result of these elections, is, of course, the importance, the imperative for bipartisan collaboration and continued engagement in between Israel and the United States, in truly advancing our shared values, because they are there, and the politicization of those shared interests or values and their personalization actually undermine our ability very often to work together. So when I reflect on, you know, the changes, and again, you know, President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, who it's also noteworthy, the first Vice President of the United States as a woman, just to take a moment and pause on that as well, as part of the changes that may be the processes that we see, or the changes that we see in America and in Israel as well. The importance of engaging through that understanding of depoliticizing and depersonalizing that relationship and maintaining that bipartisan commitment and not allowing Israel to become a wedge issue is really part of the opportunity that I think we have to both identify and grasp in every possible way. And I'll maybe talk a little bit from my parliamentary work on what I've done through that lens. And I think I spoke on another panel, and my dear friend Gil Troy spoke about the election results and about the power of moderation. And not only did I reflect on the importance of course, of his observation regarding the power of moderation, but really where it takes me as an Israeli politician is to the responsibility of moderates. And perhaps if we focus on the responsibility of moderates and engage in that responsible way, then I'll bring a few of the issues that I think highlight the way forward. So the first is, of course, the imperative to note the historic, well, potentially historic, at least, I would say, potentially end to the Arab-Israeli conflict as we know it. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention it in this context as well. And the reason for its potential, although we have had, of course, peace agreements with other countries, but the reason that there is a sense that there is a possible real potential for a shift, or the way that I at least analyze it, is this pivot away from rejectionism to normalization, but through a process of what I call the shift away from the 3 no's of Khartoum 1967, no to recognition, no to negotiation, no to peace with Israel, to the 3 yeses. Yes to recognition, yes to negotiation, yes to peace with Israel. And I would say in that order, if I may, because I believe and I think that the fundamental paradigmal shift that we can observe is the first step towards peace and reconciliation and prosperity in the region or anywhere is recognition. It's a first step. It sounds so basic, but the recognition of the other's right to exist, in this case, the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish and democratic state that it was founded to be 72 years ago, that's no small task. And there is something in the, I would say, the wings of history, or the flapping wings of history that we have felt over the last, and I spoke in the plenum when the UAE agreement was ratified, and then Bahrain. In fact, Bahrain, not only did we ratify an agreement, and Sudan, of course, is in the works, but Bahrain also adopted, and this is very interesting, not officially, but an institute within Bahrain, and adopted the IRA working definition for anti-Semitism. When I think of recognition, which enables negotiation, which paves the path to peace and prosperity, and the fundamental understanding that the IRA working definition, including the 3 Ds, delegitimization, demonization, and double standards towards the state of Israel, highlights the way or shines the path forward, I would say, to peace with all peoples, with all countries that are willing to go through that transition, or able to, identify that transition. And again, I say peoples purposely and not necessarily leadership, because it may require a transition of leadership. And here I would say that the bipartisan relationship between the United States and Israel are not only a responsibility, or not only an opportunity, but a responsibility. Because when we speak about the responses to this, historic pivot or change, we also look at the countries and the variants of I'd say both complete rejection of this transformation or transition, and also the vehemence with which it's spoken. And I speak directly about Iran, of course. And I think that the United States has a very critical role, whether we re-enter JCPOA or not, and in what format. And I'd like to speak to that for a moment and say the following. Renegotiating the JCPOA requires a whole new understanding of what was missing, and we know already what was not held, Iran was not held to account for, and also the widening of the lens from strictly the issues that the original JCPOA held to what I would call a redefining of what we have to hold to Iran to account to, whether it's human rights violations, whether it's what we know about the rights of women and the rights of journalists. And I think that the United States also has to in many ways, hold Iran to task for issues that thus far, even if we were just to reissue the same or the need for accountability and safeguards along the way, which were not assured and which we know were ignored, there has to be an identification of the additional issues that have to be a part of any kind of interaction. And that's, I think, our role in that bipartisan relationship and engagement of bringing this to the fore and maybe in many ways exposing the double standards that have thus far enabled, and I would say empowered, the culture of impunity of the Iranian regime. And from there, I would move on to, the area at large and the region, because if we talk about enabling the culture of impunity by not exposing or addressing double standards, of course, we know that in international institutions as well, in international institutions, the United States is involved in less or more. Just today, we held in the Knesset a first time informative session for MKs regarding the ICC, actually based on my appointment as the official representative in the Knesset to the issue, not to the ICC, but to the issue of the ICC internally in Knesset and in our engagement with parliamentarians around the world. And we do have many of those opportunities to engage. And I really want to hear much more from you, but I would say, in addition to understanding the imperative to address that double standard, I think that there is something to be said for the engagement with international law, or what I would call the imperative for the state of Israel to rise from the docket of the accused by reaffirming international law and utilizing the language of rights, the lingua franca of the rest of the world, and making accessible the case and cause of the state of Israel that comes into play. And I would say it's been a long process, but it comes into play or is highlighted by many, many cases. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one here, also because of the United States involvement. And that is a case that I have actually along the way had the privilege of assisting the families of 2 deceased soldiers and 2 Israeli civilians held in violation of international law, standing violation of international law and morality, of course, to which an international humanitarian ceasefire, to which the U.S. was actually brokered, and to which the United States was actually committed to. And so as we engage with the imperative to expose double standards and address double standards, while at the very same time, the state of Israel is expected and actually expects itself to grant and give humanitarian aid, well, the involvement with the United States really lends itself to the ability to, based on our shared values, based on our shared commitment to human rights and to international law, really bring to the fore the issues that enable us to expose and address those double standards, as I would call them. And finally, maybe I would just speak just a little bit about the possibility for shining the path forward for I would very directly with the Palestinians and indirectly with other countries that may follow suit.
Michal, please come to your summation.
I am. That's absolutely my last sentence. I think that if the United States was able to continue in this bipartisan collaboration, understand the fundamental paradigm shift that has occurred, then that would empower all parties, all peoples in the region to be able to use this momentum in order to really, I would say, expand the possibility of peace and prosperity for all peoples in the region and beyond. So thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to engaging with everybody else.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you. And we know you have to run to the Knesset plenum, but we hope you'll be back soon. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce, from Jerusalem to Los Angeles we go, Professor Stephen Windmuller. Stephen is the Alfred Gottschalk Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Studies at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. Dr. Windmuller is a fellow of the Jerusalem Center. He writes and lectures about Jewish political behavior and communal trends. Currently, he is editing a volume on Donald Trump's impact on American Jews to be published next summer by the University of California's Kasten Institute. Stephen, as a colleague and a friend for many years, I invite you to share with us your remarks, and I thank you for taking the initiative of the JCPA, in fact, doing this webinar. Please.
Thank you, Howard, and to all of you, good morning from Los Angeles. I would ask if my chart could be brought up on the screen so we could talk from this PowerPoint.
We're doing that.
In the meantime, let me begin by suggesting the following themes. First of all, that what we have seen in this election is actually a battle over the Jewish vote in terms of why and what it represents. In many ways, the polling data suggests that we have multiple Jewish expressions in this election. The Associated Press and the Republican Jewish Coalition provide one such response, suggesting, as you see on the chart, 69% of American Jews supporting Joseph Biden and 30% President Trump. But as you see throughout this chart, you see a variation, certainly in the South, with Florida and Georgia reflecting a very different modality, at least based on these exit polls. What we again see in Nevada and by J Street as a counterpoint, in a sense, to what we saw from the Republican Jewish Coalition is a very different perspective. And indeed, my summary of the 2020 election reads as follows. First, that American Jews did not place Israel as a central theme in much of their thinking. Outside of what I would call identity politics Jews, those who voted with core Jewish interests at heart, you do not see an overwhelming engagement with the case for Israel as part of this vote. In fact, what we are generally seeing is a kind of voice of American liberalism, on the one hand, speaking very clearly about the issues and concerns of the society at large. On the other, we see a distinctive Jewish response, especially as expressed in these polls in Florida and Georgia. This election, by the way, is not over. And in many ways, the January 5th runoff in Georgia for 2 Senate seats will again infuse a Jewish engagement, not only the 120,000 Jews of Georgia, but the American Jewish communal financial support for the candidates of their choice. In fact, as you may recall, there is a Jewish candidate running in the Senate race, as is an African American. So it reignites the kind of attention and focus on the continuation of this election. My summary is that Donald Trump may have lost this election, but received over 73 million votes, which tells us an extraordinary statement that his ideas, his politics, and his imprint are not leaving the political scene. The second principle here is that the Democrats will have to internally manage their politics, whether the left wing of the party or its centrist expressions will dominate in how this party will govern. And an outcome of this election also suggests that the core issue for American Jews is the issue of anti-Semitism. Every poll that was developed prior to this election pointed to the strong sense of insecurity and concern by American Jews. Yesterday's FBI study on hate crimes in America confirms this premise. My assessment here is that for American Jews, for the first time in their history, they are weighing the pressures of having threats to their political right and to their political left, and how that will redefine and shape American Jewish political behavior moving forward will be the core story as an outcome of this election. Finally, I would suggest that we need to understand that there is a deep and abiding interest in love for the state of Israel, but it does not and did not show up November 3rd in the context of most American Jewish voters. As long as Israel is not in crisis, American Jewish voters will not bring that issue forward in the same kind of intensity as we have possibly seen in the past. We are now in the 4th and 5th generation of the American Jewish experience, and as a result, we are increasingly going to have to deal with the re-engagement of Israel as an important theme in helping American Jews understand the mix of interests, the shared interest that they have along with other competing identities and values that have and are redefining who and what the American Jewish polity is about. Thank you for allowing me to introduce this material.
Stephen, we thank you very much for your perceptive comments. And we move now from Los Angeles back to Israel to Renana, to Dr. Erwin Mansdorf. Erwin Yitzchak Mansdorf, PhD in psychology, is a clinical psychologist and a fellow here at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He specializes in political psychology. He has recently published 2 articles on the JCPA website, which you can access following his research. And they are on American Jews in transition in July of this year, and just this past week, how American Jews voted. Erwin, if you would, please.
Thank you. And I would also ask that my material, Dan, if you could get that up. And as it's coming up, I'd like to address 3 things that Professor Windmiller said that I agree with. And I think we have to look at what I'm going to present as complementary with an E to the material that Professor Windmiller said it looked at. I don't think we should look at it as different material, but something that adds to the material that he brought up. First of all, the 3 points that he brought up about Israel not being at the center of this election, that's absolutely consistent with the data that we collected. The issue of anti-Semitism is absolutely consistent with the data that we've collected over the years. One thing I would add, overwhelmingly, the view of American Jewry is that the anti-Semitism is from the right and not from the left. And I think that's one of the things we have to take a look at in the future. And the third thing that Stephen mentioned as far as the love for Israel and voting behavior when it's not in a crisis situation, I think that came out very clear in our data as well. Although the concept, as we'll see in a second, as far as what love for Israel really means, is something that I think we're going to have to take a look at. I'd like to, get to the bottom line of a couple of things first. The polling, as much as we have to take a look at all polls and we have to see what they really mean, they really, to a large degree, they were predictably incorrect. I think a lot of people that were in the field were rolling their eyes throughout the election when we saw the predictions for a blue wave, an overwhelming Biden victory, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things that some of us took a look at and looked at the data and didn't see that coming. And in fact, that's what turned out. So we have to look at polls as something that gives us information, but we have to understand really what it means, what the drawbacks, limitations, what the effects of polling really have on people, and really what that goes. As far as the Jewish vote is concerned, we found that there was a difference between Jewish Trump voters and Jewish Biden voters as far as their willingness to publicly state that they are pro-Israel unconditionally. And we'll get to that in a second as well. And the bottom line, as far as the issues, why did Jewish voters vote for Biden as opposed to Trump? It came out really very clear cut that for the Biden voters, it really was the personality and less on the different policies. And for Trump voters, it was the policies, despite the personality that a lot of people identify President Trump with. If we could just move on, the background to the work that we've done is based on 2 years of research on Jewish Americans toward Israel. We've done focus groups and survey studies, and there's a methodological issue that I'd like to bring up. We've used the focus groups to get us information. We used the survey studies to test that information. And we looked at polls as an experiment. We didn't look at polls as something that tells us what people say. We looked at polls as really giving us what are the reactions to if we ask this as opposed to asking that. So it's a little different than typical traditional polling. And the conclusions that we reached was based on the consistency of looking at this throughout. So what are those conclusions that we saw? We see that in the next slide. Not a surprise, most Jews see themselves as liberal. They don't always see, well, they do see anti-Semitism. They don't identify being anti-Israel or questioning Israel's policy as being something anti-Semitic. They do see, as I mentioned before, that anti-Semitism is almost universally a right-wing issue, and very few identify this with the left. Israel-related issues were not a make-or-break situation as far as this election. There is a small hardcore of Jewish Americans that are openly antagonistic to Israel. They get a lot of press. We see them out there. And one of the things that we found that was perhaps somewhat surprising in some of our previous studies is that there's a willingness for people that call themselves pro-Israel to vote for people that are clearly unsympathetic to what Israel is. And in our previous studies, we found that overwhelmingly, many liberal Jewish voters would rather vote for a candidate as Rashida Tlaib or Ilan Omar over a Republican moderate, even though they consider themselves pro-Israel. And I think that's one of the things we have to consider, really, what does that mean going forward? If we move on, we see that there was some inconsistency in some of the polling data we had between, in Black Lives Matter, between theory and practice. And this is something that gave us a hint that the polls may be wrong in the future because people say certain things, but they do something else. So we found that in the public realm, people would say, I support Black Lives Matter, I support going to rallies, I support taking a knee. But when we asked them about the policies of Black Lives Matter and their concern about Israel, we saw different answers then. So I think it's something to really take out of what our data said, is that what people say and what people do. And we saw that in a lot of other areas of our data as well, in terms of what people said in focus groups and what people did in survey groups. And there was a little difference between that. The next slide, we saw that there was a lot of unfamiliarity among the American Jewish community of three issues that we think are very important. The issue of Palestinian financial support for terror, the issue of the Nazi-themed anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial within the Palestinian media, and the same thing in terms of Iran. When we probed for these issues, we found that the knowledge for typical American Jews was very low, and they didn't realize it. And when we provided information, we did see a little change in their attitudes towards some of these. So where does that come to in terms of the next slide? What we saw in terms of the election is that when we put all these issues down, the issue that, and you'll see this in the next slide, the issue that for Biden voters was clearly character and trust, and it eclipsed everything else. The issue for Trump voters was the concern for left progressive, what we called left progressive extremism. And this was not only their primary issue, it was also when we took the primary and the secondary issue together, it came to over 70% of the Biden voters felt that character and trust was the most important issue, and 60% of the Trump voters for left progressive extremism. There's been a lot of talk of shy voters, of people who say one thing and do another thing, as we pointed out. And there is shy voters, but there are shy voters on both sides. There were people, not surprisingly, that said that they would vote for Biden, but actually voted for Trump. And there were people that said they would vote for Trump, but actually voted for Biden. When you take the large numbers, at least in terms of our sample, when you take the large numbers, of course, it's much more significant on the public Biden and private Trump vote. But the numbers are there on both sides. Israel-related issues did not play a major role, as Stephen pointed out earlier. So I want to focus just for a second on the next couple of slides in terms of Israel. One of the things that we added in here.
Owen, please bring yourself to a summation, please.
What are the things that we take a look at in terms of the Jewish American vote is somebody pro-Israel, is somebody not pro-Israel? And as we see here in the next couple of slides, you'll see that when you add a third question, are you definitely pro-Israel, or is the term too vague? The vagueness issue really comes up a lot. And that's where, that's one of the things that I think is one of the bottom line conclusions of this study, is that pro-Israel is not a yes and no answer. It may in fact not be a very critical term that we could use anymore because of that. And we really have to pay attention to this issue in terms of the conditional aspect of how voters look at pro-Israel and not pro-Israel. And I'll end with that and turn it back.
Erwin, thank you very much. Very informative. We move from Renana back to the United States. And to William Daroff. William is the CEO of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. He holds a JD. He is the former Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Director of the Washington Office of the Jewish Federations of North America. William, if you would, please.
Thank you very much, Howard and Dory and everyone else at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs for hosting this important discussion today. I'm thrilled to be participating. After a long and hard-fought U.S. presidential election, a new administration will begin on January 20th. Although the reins of power in Washington will be changing hands, the special U.S.-Israel relationship will continue to thrive as it has for decades. President-elect Biden has been a friend of the Jewish state throughout his long political career, and the incoming 117th Congress will be comprised of members, both leadership and rank and file, the vast, vast majority of whom are steadfastly pro-Israel. Over his nearly 50 years of public service, Vice President Biden has had extensive interaction with the American Jewish community. He will be a well-known quantity in the White House, and his administration will likely be very accessible and responsive to our community. I believe that the slim House and Senate majorities will likely help serve as guardrails against radical extremism. With a Democrat in the White House, a razor-thin Senate majority for the party that prevails in January 5th's Georgia Senate runoff elections, and the smallest Democratic House majority in decades, there is potential for the Biden era to be defined by sensible centrism. Politics is the art of the possible, and ideological excesses will be out of reach for both parties for the foreseeable future. The big picture long-term policy decisions of the incoming administration will have significant impact in the Middle East. Iranian aggression in the region must be countered, and the Ayatollah's nuclear development cannot be allowed to continue unabated. Renegotiating or re-entering the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, is a distinct possibility that is already being discussed. It is our hope, as Michal aptly stated, that any new Iran deal be more far-reaching and comprehensive regarding Iran's actions in the region and its nuclear ambitions for the long term. The new administration will likely re-engage with the Palestinian leadership to get them back to the negotiating table, as well as consider restoring aid to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA. Vice President Biden is committed to abide by the Taylor Force Act, a congressional act that forbids U.S. funding of the Palestinian Authority's abhorrent pay-to-slay program, wherein terrorists and their families are rewarded for their murderous acts. So we'll see how they thread that needle, hopefully in a way that changes this noxious policy. All indications are that additional and historic normalization agreements between Israel and Arab and Muslim countries will be pursued. That said, we can envision greater U.S. focus on human rights issues vis-a-vis the Gulf states, which may obviously affect relations. America will likely rejoin international bodies and agreements such as the Paris Agreement, the World Health Organization, and perhaps even the UN Human Rights Council. This in turn will bring in more UN and EU involvement with confronting Iran and with addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for better or for worse. More critically in the near term for U.S.-Israel relations, as they say, personnel is policy. Personnel is policy, and certain appointments will, of course, have far-reaching consequences. Individuals who are nominated for Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, Ambassador to Israel, Ambassador to the UN, and other key roles will set the tone for the special relationship under the Biden administration. I'm certain we'll start seeing some of those appointments perhaps as early as this week, and certainly in the weeks to come. For his part, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that he looks forward to working with the president-elect to further strengthen the unbreakable bond between Israel and the United States. Like him, I am optimistic about the path ahead. Thank you again to the Jerusalem Center for organizing this webinar. I look forward to engaging further with my distinguished panelists and with the attendees for the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, I remind you that you can submit your questions in the Q&A function on your screen. To provide us a look into the future, we call on Dr. Liel Leibovitz. Liel is a senior writer for Tablet Magazine and a host of the Unorthodox and Take One Daily Daf podcast. I recommend them. I myself listen to them. He received an MS in journalism and a PhD in communications from Columbia University. Liel, bavakasha.
Thank you so much, Howard. Unlike my esteemed colleagues on this call, my doctorate is in video games. rather than something useful. So I will take this perch and the opportunity of being the last person speaking to present not sort of studious and fact-based looks into what we have seen earlier this month, but rather wild and, I admit, completely baseless kind of analyses and insights into what I think may be going on. And I'm comfortable presenting you with these wild and baseless analyses because I think in large part, as we have seen from what Dr. Mansdorf and Professor Windmuller have told us, we are looking at, if nothing else, a kind of comical collapse of so many of the institutions that we have entrusted for so long to help us make sense of our political moment. And so when we try to look at what happened on November 3rd, I think the first insightful question in true Talmudic manner is to ask what didn't happen. What didn't happen is I think this election was not about politics. It wasn't about partisanship. It wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans, as would be attested to by the slim, narrow margin that we saw. It wasn't, God bless, about these monolithic ideological divides that the left has sort of consistently tried to convince us really made up American public discourse, ideas of divisions of race and gender. Most American voters rejected those. They rejected those empathically. My one favorite statistic takeaway from this election was the notion that Donald Trump improved his performance over 2016 in every single category except for white men, which I think teaches us a lot about how fervently Americans rejected this narrative of racial divisions and this perspectives of looking at the world through the small, narrow lens of identity politics. What we did see, if we're trying to make sense of where the divisions actually lie, I think we would be well served by looking at the distinctions offered in 2016 by the unimprovably named British journalist David Goodhart, who told us that if we really wanted to understand what modern politics is about and will be about in decades to come, we should look not at left versus right or secular versus religious or any of these sort of old traditional divisions that we've become accustomed to, but rather at the division between what he called the somewheres and the anywheres. The anywheres, in his telling, were people who lived in LA and New York and Chicago and Austin. They were lawyers and doctors and documentary film producers and web developers, crafts that they could practice from literally any other point in the world to which they sometimes indeed ended up moving. And their worldview connected them to this kind of like larger class or caste, if you will, of people who shared their sensibility, who shared these ideas. If they had a belief system that was strongly pronounced, it was this new progressive religion that had in its ideas the sort of cosmology of victimhood, of righteousness, of who gets to be prioritized over other people. On the other end of the spectrum are what Goodhart calls somewheres. These are people who live in Dayton and Dallas and San Antonio, people who are deeply, deeply, deeply tethered to the local places, to the specific geographies, and to the traditions and institutions that make and sustain these communities. And if you want to see who triumphed in this election, look, for example, at the Senate race in Maine. Our intellectual betters in the media spent months and months and months telling us that Susan Collins was really under threat. She may lose the election to Sarah Gideon. Sarah Gideon, bolstered by a lot of donations coming in through Twitter and Facebook from liberals all over the country, raised $68 million. Susan Collins raised $26 million, mostly from local people in Maine, and swept the election. Now, of course, this brings us, this being the JCPA, this brings us to the question, where does it leave the Jews? I think the Jews and the Jewish vote, and I think some of the numbers that we saw here today support this, really sort of fell neatly into these two categories. If you are a person who lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan or in West Hollywood, you probably voted one way. If you're a person who lived in a different community that was more rooted for religious or geographic reasons to its origin, you were much more likely to vote very differently. I think in the long term, things are actually wildly promising for American Jews, and here's why. I think these two camps, the somewheres and the anywheres, and this bears out hours and hours more of analysis that I will spare you right now. I think they're not equal camps. I think one of them, the anywheres, is likely to discover very soon that when you set up a meritocracy and you promise people great jobs if only they go to your institutions, you come up eventually with the same problem that, say, the French landed gentry came up with in the Middle Ages of at some point having more sons and daughters than titles and estates to distribute. And then this whole class of people starts resenting you and starts clinging onto ideologies, as we're seeing today, that are deeply dangerous to the sort of survival and stability of the system. And on the other hand, you have an amazing coalition of which many, many, many Jews, and probably trusting Professor Mansdorf's data, more Jews than ever before, and Professor Windmuller's data, more Jews than ever before are a part of. This is a coalition, the likes of which I don't know that we have seen before. It includes people of various faith traditions. It includes immigrants from different communities. It includes a whole host of people, I think by far the majority of the country, that actually share a very profoundly similar American vision. This, to me, is the reason why the most prominent American media outlet today isn't to take a coinage from our maybe soon-to-be departing president, the failing New York Times, but Joe Rogan, who's a former mixed martial arts commentator who has tens of millions of people listening to him because he brings together this incredible coalition of very diverse populations. I think Jews belong very firmly in this coalition, and I think whereas the last 50 years in American public life have been about Jews Jews trying to learn how to be Americans, the next 50 years will be much more about Americans learning how to be Jews, and in doing so, be a part of this major nascent coalition of somewheres that are reshaping American politics.
Liel, thank you very much for that look into the future and where our people may be and how the kinds of coalitions that they may be a part of. Ladies and gentlemen, Q&A. If you have questions, please post them within the Q&A. We have a couple of questions at the moment. I'm going to take the first one, and for our panel, it's from David Elazar. Are American Jews worried about anti-Semitism on the campuses, which will have a greater impact on the future of the United States? I see this as more dangerous than anti-Semitism on the right, which has been around for decades. Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Stephen, why don't you start, since you're right there in the heart of the campus life as we speak?
I think it's a worthy question, and one that is certainly of concern to the Jewish community. Every poll that we have looked at in terms of the issues of anti-Semitism would suggest that the campus agenda deserves and requires a good deal of attention. And part of that is specifically tied to what I think Lael introduced us to in the notion of a kind of racist theory or identity theory that sort of suggests the cancel culture notions, the idea of intersectionality, and the discounting of Israel as somehow a pariah state. So my concern here is that the attention of the established Jewish community to this issue and to the politics surrounding it is of critical importance moving forward.
Thank you.
I'll agree with that absolutely. And Barry Weiss, obviously in Tablet Magazine, wrote a big piece that focuses on this very issue. It is something that the American Jewish community is very focused on, working with partners at Hillel and the Israel on Campus Coalition and others to push back on this scourge of anti-Semitism on campus. I think the questioner seems to dismiss a bit right-wing anti-Semitism, and I think that that's dangerous as well. We are in a place, I believe, where we can't pick and choose and say that this brand of anti-Semitism is more or less polite or dangerous or okay than any other sort of brand. So whether it's coming from the left or the right or from Islamist radicals, I think that we need to use the same sledgehammer to pound it down.
Dory, might you want to add something?
Yes, on the issue of anti-Semitism, we had a kind of new variant this past week that I want to single out as anti-Semitism. I'm speaking about the statement of Christiana Amanpour. Anybody who takes the Holocaust and makes light of it by saying that it's not. There are other. How would I put this? There are other forms of anti-Semitism out there, and make a comparison between President Trump and the and of course what happened in Nazi Germany, that cheapens the Holocaust and sets the stage for relating to it in a very superficial and hurtful manner for the Jewish people. So I think that's a new variant. You might have seen it before, but I think it's a real problem, and it's a problem we have to answer firmly and not just let it slide away because a half of an apology came out from CNN.
Dory, thank you.
Howard, if I could just for 1 second, the issue of anti-Semitism on campus, I think we have to really be careful in how we use the term on campus. There are thousands and thousands of campuses in the United States. The average college, if we're going to say that the average Jewish college student experiences anti-Semitism on campus, we have to back that up with data. And I'm not so sure we can do that. I know that on certain campuses there are questionable issues, and there's certainly anti-Semitic faculty and a lot of horrible things going on. But I think we have to be objective and consistent in how we look at it, and we might be able to refine the word on campus to really direct it to specific campuses. And that's just a suggestion that I.
Erwin, thank you. I'd like to take up the next question, and I think I would direct this both to Dory and William, but others may certainly provide their insights. The question is from Sheldon Shore. Will Biden pursue Israel's path of normalization with its Arab neighbors with the same energy and interest as Trump? Dory, William?
I'll take a crack at that.
Go ahead.
Look, I think there is a problem that exists, but it's very repairable with goodwill. In certain liberal quarters in the United States, there is a dislike of the Arab Gulf states. There is a preference for doing business with the Palestinians, and the Arab Gulf states come under a greater deal of criticism, and therefore I can see that a Biden administration might be reluctant to put all the stress of diplomacy on the Arab Gulf states, and might try and go back to Mahmoud Abbas, either alone or in concert with a few other countries. But I think that should be dealt with. And I think these countries, and I speak to them, need to be assured that America is there for them, that America will help them with their security challenge coming from Iran, and will not be negligent about the national security of our Gulf partners.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd agree with that commentary as being something we need to be on the lookout for in public and private conversations with folks around Vice President Biden. They express a commitment to continuing down this path, a recognition of probably one of the few achievements that they would publicly speak about to Trump's foreign policy. But as Dory has said, the issues around, and as I said in my initial comments, the issues surrounding looking at the Gulf states through a human rights, political rights magnifying glass is something that is very vocally connected to progressive elements here in Washington, in the think tank community and elsewhere. And my thinking on it is that maybe that is exactly the sort of card that those Gulf states could use. Pulling out a normalization card with Israel as a way to push back against that breeze that's blowing. Because it seems to me, if, for instance, our Saudi cousins were to really jump into this and put normalization with Israel on the table, it would be a very quick way to silence that portion of the progressive community as far as the influence they would have on an incoming Biden administration. So I think the door is open. I think it's something we need to be cautious of. And I think it's something that, frankly, we all and the state of Israel should work towards ensuring that there's a smoother glide path towards achieving.
William, thank you very much. Everybody, we had promised an hour. We're going to have one question that will kind of be an overview question that came from our audience, but respecting the time, both of our audience and our presenters, I present this as a last and far-reaching question that is open to any of our panelists to answer, all if they wish. The question is, it's an abbreviation from whom it came, so I really can't tell your full name, but lately there have been many very pessimistic opinions about the future of American Jewry. In parentheses, this person has mentioned the names of Barry Weiss, Daniel Gordis, etc. He'd like the questionnaire, he or she would like comments from the panel. The future of American Jewry. Who's first?
Stephen.
Go, Stephen.
Thank you. I am maybe a person who focuses on the possibilities rather than the negative scenarios. My sense is that we are seeing a huge amount of creativity, even in this moment of the pandemic, the extraordinary amount of Jewish learning that is going on, the capacity to even engage in conversations around Israel, and the dynamics of change that is happening in the American Jewish community. Yes, it will be a community in major transition, demographically, economically, and structurally, but it is a community that also has this extraordinary capacity for creative reinvention and adaptability, and that is what we will see. The question will be where Israel fits into that scenario, and that will be one of the major testing issues or challenges.
I agree with Professor Windmiller enthusiastically. You know, anecdotally, when we started our podcast 5 years ago, we were anticipating that a Jewish podcast would gather something along the lines of maybe a few thousand listeners, maybe tens of thousands if we were lucky. The number now is in the many millions, which is not just, or not, I think, primarily a testament to what we do, but a testament to the tremendous interest and engagement that so many people have. Now, this engagement, if you're looking for the penny under the lamplight, if you're looking for the same kind of institutional structures or commitments of ways of expressing your Jewish identity that we have seen for decades, you're not going to find it there. But if you travel, as I did before we were all quarantined, if you travel and talk to people and sort of kind of have this podcast and get people to share their own Jewish journeys, you see not just how passionate so many people are about discovering their own paths into Judaism, but also how passionate they are about making these paths their own. We're now seeing all these, diverse engagements that are no less, in fact, much more profound, meaningful, and true for being truly, truly authentic to how people engage with their own faith and their own community.
Something very short I want to say. I was just asked by Mosaic magazine to do a lecture series on the Arab-Israel conflict, on the Middle East, really. And I, as a person who went to Columbia University, BA, MA, PhD, do not remember anything like that occurring when I lived on Morningside Heights. That did not exist, but now it does. And now there are people who are interested. And I have to say, these are creative ideas that are coming up of how to share Jewish and Israel topics between and Israeli and the American Jewish community. And let's hope they just keep moving on.
Thank you, Dory. Thank you, Liel. And as I mentioned earlier, a fan of your podcast. I'm glad that you have that optimism, as I do, for the future of Am Yisrael. Any other thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I would just lastly add, I agree for sure there are major problems in the American Jewish community and continuity and connectivity and the whole sort of bowling alone endeavor where folks are not joining organizations. I do think, as Stephen and Liel have said, that in this pandemic, we've seen a bright potential future as we have adapted as a people. I'm reminded of David Harris from the American Jewish Committee. I don't know if he still does, but he used to hold up the 1964 cover story of Look magazine, where the cover was on the vanishing American Jew. And David says, well, 56 years later, Look magazine has vanished, but the American Jewish community is still here. And so I think it's important to take a step back and have a long view on these issues.
Great point, William. And with that, we thank you. We thank each of our panelists. We thank the audience. We thank the JCPA team led by Jennifer Roskis as Director General, and Ahuva Volk and Daniel Levine, our technical expert, Ahuva, our program director, for putting this podcast together in such an effective way. We thank all of you for joining us. We encourage you, everyone who is listening, to go to the JCPA website, jcpa.org, for our briefing papers, our newsletters, our event announcements. You can sign up. It's free to receive those elements by email, www.jcpa.org. Read, view, download excellent materials, and a recording of this webinar will be available soon. Thank you again. We say Erev Tov, Saharayim Tovin, and Boker Tov, wherever you may be. Take care, and everyone stay healthy. Bye.